Welcome to Florida.
That is the voice of best-selling author and award-winning environmental reporter Craig Pittman. My name is Chad Scott. This is Welcome to Florida, and we have another repeat guest this week. He joined us way back in episode 53. It's Jason Vuic, and that episode was about the swamp peddlers, all these land shysters and huck and jive salesmen. And I can't recommend enough people go back and listen to that episode. It's not essential for this episode, but it is so essential to understanding how Florida has always been a land of con artists, boom and bust,
hmm
and land speculation. I mean that he really does a great job. And again, this was early in the podcast. I was learning more and more about this Florida history, and that episode really has proved foundational to my
Yes.
thinking about 20th century Florida writ
hmm
large.
And
Um,
things we still cope with today.
Absolutely. And he's back with a new book that I know you've started on and really think highly of.
Yeah, yeah, I read it. It's incredible. It's A Town Without Pity, AIDS, Race, and Resistance in Florida's Deep South, and it's all about the town of Arcadia, a court case there that took quite a few twists and turns, as well as one involving three boys who got kicked out of school because they got AIDS for no fault of their own, and it's just a
Mhm.
remarkable piece of reporting.
Yeah, a little background here. Arcadia is in southwest Florida. It's about 50 miles east of Sarasota. Myakka River State Park is not far away. We've done an episode on that. The Immokalee Coalition Labor Union, we've done an episode on that. That's this part of the world that we're talking about. But this episode also has echoes to Miami in 1980. These places that experience these just remarkable confluence of events all at the same time. Of course, the Freddie Lee Pitts and Wilbur Lee episode is directly related to what we're going to get into. We mentioned Janet Reno, and we've got a Janet
Yes.
Reno episode in the archives. And if this sort of thing, particularly the Richardson case that we'll start talking about, is of interest to you, then be sure to check out our Florida Black History YouTube channel. Go to YouTube, put at Florida Black History. That's the name of the channel. And all of our previous episodes on Florida Black History, including Freddie Lee Pitts and Wilbur Lee, are in there. This is another story from Florida's Black history, but also miscarriages of justice. And again, Jason does a remarkable job with this. And, he's not an outsider to the material. He's from here.
No.
He
Yeah.
remembers this not only as a historian going back, did he do the interviews in the archives, but I always love when people, bring their personal memories that add so much richness to the storytelling that someone writing from the outside can't.
Yeah, absolutely. And so he knows the place and he knows the time period, and it really shows in his writing and reporting.
And he's going to join us and tell us all about this remarkable new book, A Town Without Pity: AIDS, Race, and Resistance in Florida's Deep South.
Jason, thanks so much for joining us to talk about your absolutely brilliant book. I'm encouraging people right now to go out and get a copy of this.
Thank you.
How did you what led you to this particular story, this set of events, this remarkable set of events in a small Florida town?
Well, I mean, as you know, I grew up in Ponta Gorda, about 100 miles south of Tampa, which was a small fishing village that was founded in the 1880s, and it was, a sleepy place until the 50s and 60s when it started to open up to northern retirees. And so, though we were a small, quiet place, we were on the Tamiami Trail, we were on I-75. We were part of the Sun Belt. But our sister city just up the Peace River, about 25 miles away, which was also founded at the same time, um, you know, Arcadia was like going to a different time. In the 80s, as I was growing up, Arcadia seemed to be in the 1950s. It seemed to be a different place. It was tough, it was rural, it was agrarian, large orange grove concerns were there, cattle families of the oldest stripe in Florida. When we had people moving in year after year and houses built year after year, Arcadia had no northern housing developments. You know, DeSoto County had maybe one, Lake Susie along the interstate. But everywhere else was, you know, almost like stepping back in time. And you wrote an article, Craig, like in the early 90s. It was great about Arcadia. And you yourself wrote, you know, coming from the gated communities and the condominiums of the coast, you said something like it was like swimming upstream in the river of time, you know, and
It
that's the
was,
way it
yeah.
felt
Yeah.
going there. And so I always wanted to capture that, you know, this other Florida. And two things happened when I was in high school, two really brutal and news-making events that kind of thrust Arcadia into the national spotlight. You know, kicking and screaming, Arcadia became known to Americans on the national news. And the first was the treatment of three HIV positive Ray boys, white hemophilia suffering boys who contracted the HIV or the AIDS virus and were kicked out of school. They were kicked out of church. And eventually, in a mysterious fire, someone set fire inside their house. Someone, there was an arson at their house. People say the family did it. Other people say that outsiders did it. But the general view in America was that someone had Molotov cocktailed their house, right? You know, that didn't happen, but that's what Americans thought. And so that was the first event when these poor boys fled the city. And the second event was a man named James Richardson, a Black migrant worker. In 1967, someone poisoned his 7 children. And he went to prison for it on withheld evidence. He most likely, almost 99%, did not do it, but he did not receive a fair trial. And just 1 year after the raid debacle, James Richardson, the evidence came out that he was innocent. And so, you go from the frying pan into the fryer, and Arcadia goes from the Rays to being the first ever episode of Inside Edition, right?
Wow.
And so I wanted to use these two events, as dark as they were, unfortunately, to kind of give us a view of this part of Florida that kind of resists change, the part of Florida that doesn't belong to the Sun Belt. You know, it belongs to the Old South. And that's really what I wanted to do in this book.
Well, tell us about the Richardson case. Let's start with that.
James Richardson was a poor Black migrant worker from Jacksonville. He had been a garbage man in Jacksonville. He'd married, and then he had another woman, another wife, and then his third, common law wife. They moved to Arcadia to pick oranges, Annie Mae Richardson. So he had a blended family of 7 children. And they made food for the kids and put it in an old refrigerator, and then went to work in the fields, Annie Mae and James. And while they were in the fields, a babysitter, a next door neighbor, Betsy Reese, came over to keep an eye on the kids and to feed them that lunch. Well, somewhere along the line, either in the preparation or in the refrigerator, somewhere, someone put parathion in the food, which was it's a banned, very dangerous Orange Grove insecticide. And so one after another, these children began to die, horrible deaths. 3 of them, I believe, were in elementary school, and they had come home for lunch and they went back to school, and they died in front of their classmates horribly. And then the others were toddlers and babies, and they died. And so a sheriff immediately suspected the father, James Richardson. And the reason he suspected James was that a traveling insurance salesman, a white insurance salesman, had come through Arcadia to the area of Arcadia called the Quarters. It's an old southern segregated town that was just, experiencing desegregation. So the Black part of town in Arcadia was and is still called the Quarters. And so this salesman was selling policies door to door, and had asked Richardson if he wanted life insurance. And Richardson said yes for everyone in the family, but he said he didn't have any money. He would only be paid the next week. And so the insurance salesman said, "I'll come back." No policy ever was written down or recorded. James didn't give him any money. And the insurance salesman said over and over and over, "I did not sell him insurance. He does not have insurance." But the sheriff at the time, Frank Klein, suspected that was the motive, and really, put his grips on James, and that was the end of the story. He was arrested. They did a lie detector test, which is not admissible in court. It's unclear what questions were ever asked of James. He was hard of hearing and a very low education, and he went to prison. There was a trial in Lee County, Florida, and an incredible, a gifted district attorney, Frank Schaub out of Bradenton, moved forward, and the interviews with a minister and also the interviews with the insurance salesman never made it into court. That exculpatory evidence was not handed over. And so Richardson went to prison, was given the death penalty, which was commuted to life on exculpatory evidence that wasn't handed over, right? He was not given a fair trial, and it was racially charged. It was ugly. And behind all this, the babysitter had been in prison for murdering her husband.
Ooh.
And so they didn't suspect her. And so rumors would swirl in Arcadia for decades that the sheriff was somehow protecting the babysitter. And there were all these unproven rumors that were written about in the papers that he had an affair with the babysitter's daughter, a white sheriff with a black woman in Arcadia, which would have been unbelievable in the 60s. That wasn't proven. Frank Klein took a DNA test to prove it in the 90s, but those rumors swirled. There were other rumors that Frank Klein allowed the babysitter to run a bolita racket, a bingo racket in the quarters, and took a cut. There were rumors that he had, all types of nefarious activities from the small town sheriff that weren't ever proven, but followed him around for years while James Richardson was in prison. So that's the first event, which rears its ugly head 20 years later when evidence comes out. Right. So that's the first event.
And tell us how the evidence came out, because this is quite bizarre.
Well, James was in prison and at Rayford mostly. In the early 70s, there was a kind of a yellow journalist. I don't even know how to describe him. Mark Lane. He was a lawyer who would grandstand and jump out in front of issues. He was a politician from New York. Very, very left, liberal, radical, almost attorney, but who liked grandstanding more in front of the press. So, for example, when JFK was shot, Mark Lane wrote the first kind of conspiracy theory tome, Rush to Judgment, popularizing the grassy knoll theory. He, within weeks of the murder, of the assassination, he had Lee Harvey Oswald's mother on a stage in New York City. To talk about conspiracies. And then he moved on to James Earl Ray, and he represented Jane Fonda, her drug arrests, in Canada, coming from Canada. He represented Jim Jones in Jonestown. He actually was in Jonestown and survived Jonestown.
Oh my.
And within a week or two was back on the college circuit making money. And
wow.
Mark Lane had read about the James Richardson story. People knew something was amiss, right? People knew, but not enough to get him out of prison, not enough to anything to happen. But Mark Lane read about it like in Newsweek during a book tour. He was speaking at USF, probably on something to do with JFK and the grassy knoll in the early 70s. And he rented a car and he drove to Arcadia and began asking questions, right? And so he wrote a book, I believe in 1971, he published, called Arcadia. And it really was not very good. It didn't do much for James Richardson, but it blasted the town for its racism. And it pointed to, conspiracies, right? That someone else probably did this. And he really pointed at the babysitter. But the book didn't do anything, right? And so
didn't sell very well either.
No, and it wasn't a very good book. I own a copy. It's more of a historical document than a book compared to his other books. But that was the rumor in town, right? That something was wrong with this case. And so in the late 70s, early 1980s, there was a local, I describe him as a good old fashioned DeSoto County ne'er-do-well,
Hmm.
fighting, drinking, pot smoking white guy
Yeah,
named Remus Griffin,
he was a
right?
pig thief or something, wasn't he?
Oh, he did a lot of crazy things,
Yeah.
right? And he'd be the guy who would walk into a honky tonk and be like, I'll fight all y'all and get beaten up in the parking lot. I talked to his daughter, wonderful, I mean, he was just one of those confusing, fascinating, interesting Southern characters
Hmm.
that our small towns put out, right? I knew some in
Yeah.
Ponta Gorda like Remus. And Remus and his brother had actually, from what I understand, heard they were young, like 18, 17, 18, 19, and they heard there was a kilo of Coke or something like that in the DeSoto County property room at the courthouse. So, like two dummies, they broke into the courthouse. and 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 this is in like 77 or sometime, and they
Hmm.
both get arrested, and Remus gets sent to adult prison, though he's 17.
Hmm.
And so he's let out after like 2 years, and he's a felon on parole, and he hates the police. He's got a bone to pick with that sheriff and that town, and just a tough local guy. And he's dating a woman who is the secretary of the former assistant district attorney, who worked with Frank Schaub, the Bradenton attorney who had withheld evidence. And this attorney supposedly, allegedly, and it was reported widely, was an old Arcadia family, Treadwell, Red Treadwell, old family from the way back, 100-year-old family, fifth or sixth generation. He would come to work, and the story was that he would drink, and by noon he'd be blotto, and he would cry and say to the secretaries, "I put an innocent man in prison. I put an innocent man in prison." And everyone knew he meant James Richardson. And he denied that later in the press, but his secretary said he did say that, right? It was widely reported. Once he told the secretary, "I have the files right there. I have the files in my office." And Remus hears this from his girlfriend. He's 22 years old on parole. This is like 1980. And he's like, "Oh, honey, can I borrow your keys? I'm going to go out to get some cigarettes." and, and he goes to the office of this former ADA,
Wow.
a powerful attorney from a powerful family, and he essentially breaks in. He opens the door, goes and gets the files, and locks the door behind him. And there's no indication that Treadwell said, "Hey, someone broke into my office." Nothing was said. Who knows when he found out? But Remus suddenly realizes, wait a minute, I'm a felon. I can go back to prison for a long time.
Hello.
And
Yeah.
and if the sheriff is who everyone claims he is, or the rumors, I might be thrown into the Peace River and never emerge, right? We
Hmm.
don't know. So
Yeah.
Remus hands the evidence over to a kindred spirit, a woman who had worked for the sheriff's department in DeSoto County, who did not like the sheriff, who did not like Frank Klein, and who claimed that Klein had sexually harassed her, had mistreated her and other women, and just told me all these stories. An old retired woman, fascinating woman. She said, "Give me the files." And then eventually she remarried and moved to Clewiston, right? So she's working for what, Hendry County Sheriff's Department
Hmm.
or Clewiston Police, one or the other.
Yeah.
I forget what it was. And she's living in Devil's Garden, right? She's living in this prairie. I believe she's on the Seminole Reservation. I
Yeah.
believe it's property owned by the Seminole Reservation. But she takes that box with her, and nothing happens for almost a decade, right? It just goes quiet. Remus
Hmm.
goes back to being Remus, getting arrested, fighting, whatever Remus does. He actually became a photographer for the local paper. He actually did some really interesting things. And so what happens is, like in 87 sometime, a woman, the babysitter, has Alzheimer's or dementia, and she's in a nursing home in Hardee County in Wauchula. And she starts saying to anyone who'll listen, "I killed them babies. I killed them babies."
Man.
Right. And no one knows if she, she couldn't testify. She could barely speak. I read all the files, and the doctor said, this isn't a woman who has any control of her faculties. But, maybe she meant I was there and I fed them that food that was poison and I didn't mean to, or I didn't know, or maybe she meant I did do it. But her caregiver, one of her caregivers, was from the quarters, was from Arcadia. So she goes back, and the talk goes around, and somehow that talk reaches Mark Lane back in wherever he lived by then. I know he moved to Memphis after Jonestown. And it gets back to Lane, who comes to Arcadia in 1988 in August, and he has, like a moment of truth rally where he speaks at the old segregated high school, which is now a community center, Smith Brown School, and you can imagine, right? No AC, the African-American community, they're using their fans to listen to this story that they all remember from their youth about this man. And he was saying, is there anyone who wants to come forward? Is there any more information you could give me? Well, at the end of this meeting, who comes up to him? But Remus Griffin. And Remus says, I have a box. I have evidence that you need to read. And so begins the freeing of James Richardson.
Wow.
And so how did it eventually reach the governor's office, did it not?
Yes. Lane is phenomenal at, stroking the press. He'd been on every nightly talk show, and he's already thinking about making this a Hollywood story. Steve Jaffe in Hollywood, he's trying to make a buck, right? Mm-hmm. And so he gets it on Inside Edition. They interview James Richardson in prison. He becomes, Richardson's attorney. Once it gets on Inside Edition, David Frost, the great David Frost, was the first Inside Edition host, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, the British television personality. And he ends this episode with, I think this man is innocent, don't you? Write to your governor today, write to your governor now. And he puts the address on Inside Edition. And they get, I don't know, but tens of thousands of letters. And then the Congressional Black Caucus gets involved.
Who was the governor of Florida at the time?
Bob Martinez.
Okay.
A Democrat from Tampa.
He was the Republican by then.
Oh, he was a Republican. I didn't know that.
He was a Republican by then, yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. It gets to Martinez, who, feels the heat, feels some pressure. Mark Lane has a press conference in Tallahassee, where he strokes the press. He's hitting all the newspapers. Now we get, the great Peter Gallagher of the St. Petersburg Times at one time. He was writing for the Seminole Tribune, Seminole Herald paper for the Seminole Reservation. He starts to write for the Miami Herald about this. There's Wayne Hicks at the Sarasota paper. Craig, you probably did something on this, right? Your time.
I covered the hearing where he was freed.
Oh my!
Yeah, right.
It's quite amazing. Yes, with Janet Reno leading basically saying this is what was wrong with the case, and Judge, we hereby move to free Mr. Richardson and dismiss the indictment.
Yeah, and so the governor appoints Janet Reno, right, who was an attorney.
She was the prosecutor from Miami.
Yes, and she had such a reputation for being a fair dealer, and she came into Arcadia in 1989, early 1989, March, April, sometime in there, in this unbelievable scene. I think you were there, Craig. She stared down, Frank Schaub, the district attorney, now retired and been a judge in Bradenton, a huge figure in legal circles in Southwest Florida. And in the Suncoast, she stared him down and laid out all the evidence, laid out what was wrong with the case, and showed these, interviews that had been ignored, showed the evidence that had been ignored. No insurance policy. He didn't have a policy. The guy made the same statements over 30 years. A minister, he had told the minister, I don't have insurance. That was left out, right? And so it was just a miscarriage of justice. I mean, an absolute miscarriage of justice. And this poor man not only lost his children, he lost his life in prison, right? He was in Rayford, and part of what they did in Rayford was periodically they would show the people on death row, they'd show them the chair. This is what you're
Wow.
going to get, you
Old
know,
Sparky. Old Sparky.
you know,
Yeah.
horrible existence for this poor man. You know, do I know if Richardson is absolutely innocent? You know, I can't say that, but do I know that he's probably 99%
Yeah.
innocent, I would guess.
Yeah.
And I would definitely say he did not receive even the hint of a fair trial, right? He was, you know, they took away this man's basic human dignity and constitutional rights to railroad him. And so by this point, Arcadia, I think, was kind of happy that it came out. You know, most people, even, you know, even with that white black, you know, dichotomy there, I think even the most conservative or you know, racist whites there were happy this came out, because it was hanging over the city for 20 years, for 25 years as something around their neck.
Moving on, and the other through line of the book is these three little white boys. We should mention, as race is such a big component in the first story we've shared here, but these are three white boys, hemophiliacs. Again, we're talking about the 1980s now, the AIDS epidemic, blood transfusions, all sorts of hysteria, misinformation, panic, and they contract the AIDS virus. Again, you're growing up at this time. How was the coverage of this story handled in the area?
Well, you know, that was the era, you know, when AIDS hit the US in the early 80s, you know, we didn't have testing for it. We didn't protect our blood supply, right? And so people associated AIDS and HIV with gay men. You know, there was a lot of anti-gay hysteria. But when AIDS first really came out, they called it the 4-H disease. Heroin users, homosexuals, people with hemophilia, and Haitians. Those were the groups in America that really presented themselves first in numbers. And so people realized this was coming. This was a virus that was going through the blood supply. And when you have hemophilia, historically, like well into the 20th century, if you had hemophilia, you had a short life. You had a short and ugly life until they figured out a way to give you the protein that would help your blood clot, right? And so if you don't know anything about hemophilia, like I didn't know anything about it, you know, you envision someone's, you know, cutting their knee or skinning their knee and bleeding to death. But really it wasn't that. It was bumping your head or, you know, turning quickly and having whiplash and bleeding internally. And in decades of bleeding internally, you're going to die young, right? You couldn't have surgery. And so by the 70s, by the late 60s, they'd invented a protein. It was a blood protein taken from pooled blood that you could put distilled water in and inject into your arm. And so even children could suddenly play tennis. They could have families. People could live into their 60s, 70s. You know, it was miraculous until HIV, right? So the same places that pharmaceutical companies, you know, they wanted to keep costs down. So where did they get blood? Haiti, Skid Row, you know, heroin users, right? You know, they got it from poor people. And this is how the Ray boys at a hospital in St. Petersburg, they went to All Saints, you know, or from their blood factor, from pharmaceutical companies. And All Saints is where they took their test. They were going to go for another surgery. One of the boys had a small surgery and they did HIV testing on the boy. He came up positive, and so did the other brothers. And so when news hit Arcadia, we were still in America in that period. We, you know, they called it afraids, right? When people, and Craig probably remembers this too, like you would see a small town, you know, in Iowa where a bartender would have HIV and the whole town would boycott the bar. And it would ruin businesses. It would ruin lives. People were fired, you know, summarily fired if you had HIV.
Because people thought it was spread by casual contact when it was not.
Right. Not that there's any defense of it, but yes, people weren't sure, is this airborne? If I touch someone with AIDS, will I get, and at that point, it was a death sentence, period. You know, obviously. I mean,
And I have to say, I thought your book was a stinging indictment of the blood companies, the blood supply companies, the people making the factor for the hemophiliacs.
Yeah, the pharmaceutical companies would settle eventually, but the bottom line is a European company, there was a way to pasteurize blood. You heat it for so long like you would milk, right? And it would kill the viruses. And they figured out a way to do it. But the argument of people with hemophilia was that these American companies chose not to do it because it was more expensive. And then the Hemophilia Association that represented people with hemophilia received a huge amount of its funding from pharmaceutical companies. So they openly and knowingly drug their feet, right? That was the argument that people with hemophilia made. And it really was an Armageddon for people with hemophilia. It killed almost everyone, huge numbers of people with hemophilia. If you had hemophilia in 78, 79, odds are you got HIV by the mid 80s.
Oh.
Right. And it just, you're talking thousands and thousands of people who had overcome this terrible disease to live very nice lives. And it hit the Rays, in this insular town, in this Florida cow town. And I don't even mean that in a negative way. It's a cattle town. Arcadia.
Literally, yeah.
It's literally a cattle town with one of the longest running rodeos in the United States, not Wyoming or Texas, but Arcadia. And they just weren't equipped. Poor education levels were very low. And so the rest of America are seeing the after school specials by 86. Don't fear Ryan White. Don't run away from kids with AIDS. We can be friends. See, I can hug someone with AIDS, right? It's everywhere. By the time I was in high school in 86, 87 as a freshman, there was still fear, but it was over sex. There wasn't fear anymore of the salad bar, the sneeze guard, sharing a toilet seat, right? Using the same toilet seat. That was ending. And even the statistics showed that. But Arcadia didn't quite get the memo, right? It was people in Arcadia. One of the historians of Arcadia, I think it was George Lane or Melton, one of them, said, we're 50 miles and 50 years from Sarasota. Right. And I think that other places in America acted stupidly, acted insanely. Rich suburbs in New Jersey, New York City, in Brooklyn, Bradenton had a kid they kicked out of school. Miami kicked out 3 girls with AIDS. But by the time the Rays had that and the town reacted so insanely, I mean, they were kicked out of their church. They even kicked the sister out of school for 2 or 3 weeks. The sister didn't have HIV.
And wasn't hemophilia.
And so when I interviewed people, they'd say, we just didn't know. We just didn't know. And I don't blame them individually for being afraid. I mean, these are hardworking, tough people. They're working on ranches. They're working as prison guards. They're working at the State Mental Institute. They don't have time to read all this. What I get mad at retroactively is looking at the school board, the mayor, the Chamber of Commerce, everyone in a position of authority as a spokesman. They should have known better. Miami-Dade County schools had already settled in court. I mean, it settled, they gave a lot of money to these Haitian girls and let them back into school before the Ray case ever hit. The Supreme Court had settled the case on tuberculosis with a Flagler Beach teacher who had been fired in the 80s. It gone all the way to the US Supreme Court. And when she won, saying that when my disease is not easily transmissible, you can't fire me, the newspapers didn't say it was a TB case. They said it was an AIDS case. So employers already knew by 87. Florida school systems already knew by 87. But DeSoto County willingly and aggressively refused to let these boys back into school, right? And so that's how I get into, a history of resistance, on Florida's prairie. The leaders, they had a big rally and they formed a citizens group when a federal judge let the Rays back into school. It was like early August, and they formed a 1,000-member parental rights group that rallied against children with AIDS in schools. And they had ministers railing against gays. It's nothing to do with the Rays. They had, rebel flags, and one of the leaders said, they're shoving this down our throats like they did with civil rights, right?
Wow.
And so it became this almost like what was the John Grisham book, Time to Kill?
Hmm.
When the community got nuts and the media went nuts. I mean, the trucks were lined up down the street, a dozen cable news trucks, and ABC News comes to the town. They did a segment in which they never said it. That's a fascinating thing. I got the tapes from the Vanderbilt News Archive. They never said those words, but they had a graphic that said, Peter Jennings said, "When we come back, a town and 3 boys with AIDS." And the graphic said, "A town without pity?" Question mark.
Mm,
That
mm.
alone. And the next day, it was national, global. This is a town without pity. This is the
Well,
town without pity.
yeah, that's interesting. And uneducated people are easy to scare and whip into hysteria. Our president is a master of it, and people will do outrageous things like you're talking about. I mean, these are 3 perfectly innocent little white boys who obviously did nothing wrong to attract this disease or the attention from it. I want to pick up with that, a town without pity. What an incredible line. Was it a town without pity?
No, and see, that's the problem too. All the people who had any kind of levers in power there, were openly shrill. The superintendent of schools compared kids with AIDS in schools to citrus canker, right? And everyone knows you burn it out. Now, come on, dude. Come on,
Yeah.
right? And then you have, I mean, even Ronald Reagan called out Arcadia.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan spent his whole first term, 4 years, and never once mentioned AIDS
Mm-hmm.
through the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But his first talk, when he finally came out, he mentions Arcadia and says something like, I'm paraphrasing, but like, "This shouldn't happen in the land of the free and the home of the brave. This is good old fashioned fear." Right? He would later apologize when Republican lawmakers in Central Florida started to complain, but he called out Arcadia, right? And so, I think there were people there that were kind, but the Rays were destitute. They didn't have jobs, they didn't anything. Their attorney, they found a woman in Bradenton, a fascinating, self-made, tough woman to represent them, and she says, "Yeah, there might have been some good people after the fact when they got burned out and it looked really bad. But when I was representing them, she told me that there weren't a lot of do-gooders beating on the door with crock pots. There were people
Well, I mean, they
from
were kicked
other
out of the
towns."
church,
Yeah,
which I think demonstrates the level of hypocrisy, in 1,000 ways that I don't think I have to, sort of, detail.
Yeah.
That is supposed to be the site of mercy, the site of, from Jesus to Mother Teresa with the lepers. I mean, that is supposed to be
Treating people the way you want to be treated.
and a sanctuary for
Yeah.
all, regardless, period. And obviously it was not.
well,
Yeah.
the thing that I want to mention is, I tie this, this was the Florida frontier, even in 1900.
Yeah.
There were
Mhm.
range wars in the 30s out there, in the 30s, not just in the 1890s. This was a tough place historically, going down towards Immokalee and LaBelle and, out Pardee and Wamama, those places. I believe Wauchula was a sundown town for a long time. Maybe I'm wrong. Arcadia wasn't, but I know in Arcadia, well into the 60s, you couldn't leave the quarters after a certain time.
Mhm.
You couldn't go to the downtown. The police would chase you back, right? And so what's fascinating is it has this tough history, but a history of resistance, resisting federal mandates, resisting the state, resisting, Craig hit upon this. I think you did an interview with a Florida historian, and something like, this rugged individualism has served Americans well heading west, heading into the frontier. You're relying on your own, you're relying on your gun and your knife.
Some
But
Americans, not all Americans, certainly not Native Americans.
Yeah.
exactly. But one of the legacies of that is violence,
Yeah.
is resistance. And so instead of helping these children, the town saw them being put upon. We're not a town without pity. How dare you call us that? And they circled the wagons in every way. And they did that after the Richardson case.
Mhm.
This is what these towns do. You know, the New York Times in 1960, I found an article. It was an editorial in the New York Times, and it was called "A Florida Enigma." And someone had traveled through DeSoto County, a writer, and wrote, "There are people here who have not left the county in 5 generations." You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And that was in the New York Times. And so what I find fascinating is the Rays get an attorney, and Louise Ray, the mother, you know, a high school graduate, a practical nurse, she's just as tough as them. She's from there. She's one of them. And so she resists, and she goes to the press, and she begins playing the press, Sally Jesse Raphael and Larry King, and anywhere she can go and anyone who will listen. And so then the story in Arcadia becomes, she doesn't care about those boys. She only wants the money. She only wants the trips. Well, they got to go to Knott's Berry Farm because it was the Make-A-Wish Foundation.
Yeah.
They're dying.
Yeah.
Keep your eyes on the prize, neighbors.
Mhm.
Right?
All that big Sally Jesse money.
Oh yeah, and certainly they did enjoy those trips. And certainly there were times when I was reading, I'm like, did you really need to do that? Was that a good idea? You know, and later on, Ricky Ray says he was going to marry his high school girlfriend. He was like 15, and they went right to the St. Petersburg Times or the Sarasota paper and said, "Hey, we got news."
Yeah.
Right. And so there was a time when they were probably skirting that line between,
Yeah. Chasing
know,
the spotlight.
chasing the spotlight.
At the other hand, you tell me how to deal with 3 terminal illnesses with
Exactly.
children, and
Exactly.
let that person cast the first stone.
Exactly.
Thanks for telling me how to be a parent of 3
Yeah,
kids
yeah.
who are going to die through no fault of their own. I appreciate the advice.
Yeah.
I'll hang up and listen.
And
Yeah.
so, you know, you would see just really horrible comments in town. You know, I was down, like one woman, it's a quote, I'm paraphrasing, but you know, I was downtown, and the Rays, they just drove by over and over, wanting to be seen. You know what I mean? Like, they just want the attention. And you'd see those comments over and over. And then the press didn't help in that when they came to Arcadia, and I'm not saying Craig ever did this when he was a journalist, but when they would come to Arcadia, they were almost like, you know, I studied former Yugoslavia. I was a historian. I taught in college, and there was a line in Bosnia, like, "Anyone here been raped? You know, let's interview you." You know,
Holy cow.
in the press, the press would come to Arcadia, and they would look for the most shrill voices.
Yeah.
Right. And they found people. One woman would say these awful things, and she was in the newspaper, and it went national. AP, UPI, they were all there. And someone people would pick up the phone and call this woman in Arcadia. They would look up her number in a phone book and prank call a woman they saw to be bigoted.
Yeah.
And so this woman makes a comment, "Every queer in California has been calling me." And it just snowballs. You know, it brings out the worst of the community. And there weren't a lot of voices of moderation, right? And it got uglier and uglier and uglier until the crescendo was the fire, right? And I always thought, I was 25 miles away. I mean, I was there. I remember all of it. I always thought, I had visions of Mississippi burning. I had visions of you know, rednecks in trucks throwing bottles of liquor with wicks, and, you know, but the fire started inside the house while an uncle was there. And so then it became the national news, the Rays have been firebombed. Bigotry wins. But locally, the news was, there's something fishy about the fire. Right? And so it's just, it's ugly. And, you know, this is the hardest book I've ever written. You know, I wrote about the Yugo car. I wrote about the Buccaneers, you know, and this was hard. It was hard to put it together.
Not a lot of up news. What's Arcadia like today?
Well, it was really walloped with the hurricanes, and in I believe the 90s, G. Pierce Wood, the state mental hospital, it was, you know, a 1,000 patient annex to Chattahoochee. It went out, and that's an incredible number of jobs. One paper called it, you know, the path to the middle class, the path in Arcadia to work. You know, whole families worked there. They also worked at the prison.
That was that was where Clifford Ray worked, wasn't it? Didn't he work at the prison?
Yep, he worked at the prison. He was a prison guard, and he found it difficult to work there. And so Arcadia has really, really suffered and has remained almost entirely agricultural. I mean, you can look up, Google Earth DeSoto County and just look down. And you Google Earth Fort Myers, Lee County, and it's just lot after lot after lot after lot. And you do the same thing in DeSoto County, and it's one of the great bread baskets of Florida. But that's also kind of guaranteed poverty, right? It reminds me going there like going to Salinas, California, Steinbeck World, or the Valley in Texas, going way south, right, near McAllen. One thing that did happen that's changed. When I wrote the period I wrote about, Arcadia was about 80-20, 70-30 white and black. Historic white-black relationships, not a very pretty history, but it was white and black. It could have been a town in Mississippi. But in the late 80s, there were several freezes in Central Florida. And so the orange grove companies moved millions of trees down to Charlotte, DeSoto, Hendry, and Glades counties, millions of trees. And they take about 5 years to bear fruit. And what no one really knew, and I never knew, was, well, once that happens, you're going to now have migrant workers. And so you go to Arcadia today, and it's 25% Latino migrant laborers, right? Hispanics. And it's changed the culture of the town. They have soccer leagues and Catholic celebrations, and it's a fascinating place. And the radio channels play Latin music, and that never existed in the 80s. I mean, that was the old white black belt of Florida, right?
Yeah.
And so it's changed. Downtown Arcadia has a neat old downtown, and they have antique stores there now. They've had them over the last 25 years, but it's really struggling. It's 1 year in the last 10, it was the poorest county in the state, which blows my mind that you can be that close to I-75 in the coast, that you might not have a lot of money, but you're not going to be one of those counties, off into the northern panhandle that you think are wretchedly poor, but it's right down here in the heart and core of Southwest Florida that you could be in the top 5 poorest. It blows my mind. And so it is still, I argue, still largely the same orange and cattle town in 2025 that it was in 1925, that it was 100 years ago. And to think that a town that close to the water can resist change, when that's the only constant we know, Craig,
Yeah.
and Chad, right, in Florida, is change begets change. And that's what we do. We've added 2 to 3 million people a decade for 7 decades. And then we've added 3 million people in 5 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And somehow Arcadia has not become an HOA heaven, a Canadian retirement heaven. There are no developments. There's only one place, Lake Susie, a very small Port Charlotte-like development, but there are no others, right? And I find that beyond fascinating as a historian.
Do they still do the rodeo, the granddaddy of them all, as they call it?
Oh yeah, and it's sponsored, and a lot of money comes in from Mosaic. The phosphate company is trying to move south into DeSoto County, and to their credit, the people in DeSoto who are very proud, and I'm a little nervous at how this book will be received in DeSoto, but I also know some people will like it. I think it's true to the history, and I'm not going to sugarcoat something. And as an historian, I don't work for the Chamber of Commerce, right? And I'm sure you deal with those. You've dealt with that as a writer for many years. I get nervous, right? But I don't work for the Chamber of Commerce. I'm a historian, and I try to call it as close to what I believe, what happened and how these two events kind of show this town as a near changeless agrarian rural community in Florida that seems impossible to be.
Jason Vuic, the book A Town Without Pity, AIDS, Race, and Resistance in Florida's Deep South, a spectacular piece of history and a real slice of Florida and Americana in the 1980s. Thank you so much for joining us once again. Bravo.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jason. The story that Jason was talking about that I did back in the early 90s, I had found out that Frederick Remington, the great Western artist, had gone to Arcadia in the 1890s to write about and depict the cowboys that were there. The West had gotten tame, and so Remington was looking for other cowboys to write about. So he came to Florida to write about the range war that was going on in DeSoto County and to write about Florida cowboys, or as he called them, low-browed cowfolk who would fight over cattle that were not sufficient for a pointer dog to mess on. So basically, he didn't like what he saw, and
Yeah.
I contend it's one of the earliest depictions of Florida man that you'll ever find, is the way he talked about it. But he also talked about this sort of Paul Bunyan character in Florida history, Bone Mizell, who was a legendary cowboy who fought in those range wars and was famous for his prodigious drinking as well. There was one of the stories that goes around about him is his fellow cowboys, after he got drunk one night and passed out, they dragged his bedroll out of the camp and then built a fire around where he was sleeping. And when he woke up, because he smelled the smoke, he looked around and the fire was all around him. He said, died and gone to hell, no more than I expected.
Welcome to Florida.
Welcome to Florida.